The following is a conversation with Tracy Silverman. Most of you watching this video will know exactly who Tracy is, but for the few of you that don't, Tracy is one of the first true pioneers and poets of the electric violin. In this conversation, we discuss his unique journey, both in terms of his stylistic development, but also his approach to gear over the years. We talk about how the electric violin has developed and changed since the early 80s. We talk about Tracy's breadth of experience from playing the electric violin in rock bands and grunge groups all the way up to being an orchestral soloist, and how taking the electric violin into so many different environments has changed his approach to tone and sound design. We talk about the evolution of his distortion sound, tips and tactics for amplified string players, principles for building your own rig, Tracy's morphing distortion technique, and a really cool pickup microphone blending concept that I had never even heard of. On a personal note, Tracy has been a huge influence in my playing, and I think most of the creative string community. And I'm so grateful he took the time to have this conversation. And with that, I give you Tracy Silverman. Tracy, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you, man. It's nice to do this in reverse. I interviewed you recently for the Greater Groove podcast,
That's right.
and
One of my favorite podcasts on string. I'd say my favorite string playing podcast for
you
sure.
had so much great info to share with my listeners, and so happy to try to return the favor.
Yeah, man, it was such a cool hang. And I remember, I think I may have started that conversation saying, Tracy, you're kind of the famous one in this conversation. I should really be interviewing you.
I think you did
And
say that.
yeah, so yeah, it all worked out in the end. And I just felt like
Yeah.
now would be a really good time to talk about the whole idea of developing your own voice. Developing your own voice as an amplified string player, as an electric string player. When I think of people that really have their own sound in that genre, that's something that's unique and compelling, I almost always think about you. And so I wanted to just have this chat with you now while this is both kind of fresh in our minds. First, obviously, I want to talk about the new piece and what that process is like, kind of bringing the violin into to life in that concerto, but also just to discuss the whole sort of general idea of shaping your own sound and sort of what that entire process over your career has been like for you.
Yeah, yeah. Good questions, man. Good questions, and love talking about this stuff. As you know, um, as you are really invested in the future of strings, like what's going to happen going forward. There's strings have a wonderful past, but the future remains to be seen, and I think there's so many possibilities that you are exploring and that I'm exploring, and so this is where my heart is. Um, the idea, that concept of having a voice, it's an interesting thing because I did not have any sense that I had my own musical voice until well into my professional career. Um, I remember, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so ago. I've been around for a while. And I was listening back to some stuff that I had done early in my career, and at the time, my musical life has been so eclectic and so all over the map and kind of schizophrenic. I started at Juilliard, right? It's just totally classical. Then I kind of really got into jazz for a minute with a few friends there, but immediately switched gears into sort of metal, hard rock stuff that I started doing with electric instruments pretty much as soon as I got out of Juilliard, and just joined rock bands. And I was really into this super distorted kind of sound.
Mm-hmm.
And stayed in that area and in the pop world, like writing songs, trying to sort of write hit songs and be a rock star. Pre Turtle Island, so I had a band called Stradivarius
Okay.
that for like 10 years in New York. And then I had a band in Minneapolis called Gut Bucket that was a real kind of grunge, odd meter, Soundgarden-y, Melvins, whatever, Um, and I was in that direction. And then suddenly got this call out of left field to be Turtle Island, and then was like acoustic jazz guy with a silk shirt on,
Right.
and then playing like
Different color
Indian,
silk shirts.
exactly, color and the solid colors, and then doing like Indian, like really Carnatic classical Indian stuff with Terry Riley, and then Brazilian stuff like that, North Meets South record. So, jazzy, rocky, classical world, like all over the map. Then the John Adams stuff and these concertos, the new Roberto Sierra piece. So the point being that I never felt like I had a coherent voice, right? And this was a struggle for me through my, well, long into my career, 20, 30 years into my career. I'm like, I'm doing this, now I'm doing this, I'm jazz, now I'm rock, what's the real me?
Yeah.
And what I was started off saying was that about 10 years ago or so, I listened to some of that really early stuff and I go like, oh my God, that sounds just like me. Like that's the way I still do that same riff. You
Yeah.
know, like there are things that were so identifiable and like to me don't sound like anybody else and and it was so weird that that stuff was there the whole time. I had no idea. I could not see it until I could turn around long in retrospect and take a look and go, oh, that's the path. There's the path. I can clearly see it. But at the time, it was just like a forest of trees. I didn't know where I was. I think what happens is we have influences that really dig into us and live in us when we're in our teens, in our 20s, and younger, when our ears are fresh and absorbing everything, we go, that's what I love. We find what we love, like Hendrix, that sound, or Miles Davis. I remember spending weeks just trying to get this one note that Miles Davis got. And I was just like, I gotta get that.
Yeah.
And when you feel something like that, it gets so deep in you, or like the Prokofiev violin concertos. Just I grew up listening to those, going, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard anywhere. Stuff like that. That kind of deep-seated musical influences. I think once they get in there, they're there.
Hmm.
You spend the rest of your life trying to recapture those moments that you felt.
It's like the
You
first
know,
kiss, right? The first toke, the
exactly.
first whatever. Yeah. There's.
Exactly, to try to get that high that you felt,
Hmm.
and it made such an impression. And so the rest of my career as a composer has been trying to write something as good as that Prokofiev or as great as that Hendrix lick or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, and anyway, so and I guess the point is that that's what creates your voice, is your attempts to do that throughout your life. And as I look back in retrospect, I saw, oh yeah, I was going for that. I was trying to sound like Miles there. I was trying to sound like Jimmy there. I'm trying to.
Especially when I was coming up, and definitely when you were coming up, there just weren't a lot of models for, this is how a rock violinist sounds, much less this is how an electric violinist sounds. I mean, maybe you had, Ponte with Zappa, or, but so few examples of
Right.
like actual, there are a couple of players, especially if you get into the blues, but when you talk about like really compelling, like
No.
happening, you know what I mean? It didn't
No.
exist. And so,
Especially in the rock world. See, like when me and Mark Wood started making these instruments in 1981.
yep,
He already had started. I always give him credit. He had built the first six string, and then he showed me how to do it. I didn't
yeah,
come up with that idea. He was doing that, but he was only doing it for like a year or so before
right.
I found out about it and joined him, and then so um, uh, point being that all that we wanted to do back then was to sound rock and roll, because Jean-Luc had taken the jazz thing about as far as we could see, playing. I mean, just his command of bebop and all that kind of stuff, and
Yeah,
we didn't want to sound like Grappelli or anything old fashioned, and we weren't interested in playing jazz. To be honest, we were
right.
interested in rocking out. just because that's what we were into. And
Mhm.
as like I like I explain to try to justify my career to people. I was just all my life just trying to sound like a guitar player.
Right.
I make no bones about it. And the reason for that is because I was trying to play stuff that my friends would get.
Yeah.
I just wanted, my friends were not listening to jazz. I just wasn't hanging out with anyone that cool. My friends were listening to Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Hendrix, and whatever, all that stuff in the '70s.
Right.
Um, and because that was, when I grew up, that was the rock and roll was king, right? And
Sure.
everybody had a guitar player hero like you have a quarterback hero. But at any rate, so I just wanted to play music that my friends would like, and that's
Yeah.
what my friends listened to. And that
Interesting.
was, because for me, playing music was partly this mission to change the future of strings, which I was feeling even at that moment, even like stepping out of Juilliard and starting and joining a rock band in Co-op City in the Bronx, with my first band that I joined. I was like, I'm gonna be the first, rock
Rock
star with
violinist.
violin. I
Yep.
mean, that's what me and Mark were competing. We
Yeah.
both wanted to be the next Jimi Hendrix. So that was our goal.
Right.
We made no bones about it, and we wanted to try to revolutionize the way violin was played and the way it was seen. And then later, my the more serious sort of side of my mission was to get this new instrument that we were going to popularize in the next year and a half or 2 years. It was clear we were going to become, huge rock stars. And then
Hmm.
5 years from now, in the distant future, after we had had multiple hits and playing stadiums,
Sure.
we would then bring this new instrument, like Moses with the tablets.
Down from the mountain.
Down and bring it to the concert stage and say, here, now write something for us, for these great things. We would and get great composers to write works that would be then accepted on the concert stage and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But first, we knew we had to prove it to the rock world, and that was our goal.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's of any interest in terms of the tech part of it, but that's kind of a long story of
No, no, that's
where
really
my
cool.
where my goals were.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it encapsulates a lot of kind of the journey that a lot of us go through. It's like we're trying to prove ourselves to our teachers, then we start a different style and we want to feel like we're the first, which you guys actually were at that time. But, then we want to prove ourselves to the rock guys. And then the question is like, what am I doing? Eventually we try to get to what am I doing that's actually not just an imitation of a guitar, because there's a lot of guitars. What am I doing that's me? And that's really like a full circle kind of thing. Before we dive into all that, I thought it might be cool to make a beeline, just because it's top of mind, to the concerto. I feel like in this world, it's such a different thing because there's not the same aesthetic pressure, maybe, to sound just like a guitar, just like a synth, as there is if you're playing in a blues trio or a rock band or a folk ensemble, right? Standing next to horns or whatever.
Right.
So
Yep.
maybe tell us a little bit first about the piece, like how it came about, and then a little bit about the process of, how you went about designing the sounds. Did the composer you're working with have any preconceived notions? How
Right.
much freedom did you have there?
Yeah. Good questions. So the composer Roberto Sierra um, is a very experienced composer. He's written a lot of concertos, a lot of stuff, orchestral stuff for strings. So he's very well acquainted with the idea of how to write for strings. Um, but when we first started working together on this piece, the reason I wanted to work with him was because he uses a more vernacular style in his writing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'm not, and neither he nor I are big fans are of, is this sort of avant-garde modernist style that was sort of mid-century
Right.
modern, pretty much, very challenging stuff, either completely atonal or, um, whatever, this sort of more modernist style. Um, we both kind of feel like that's just not speaking to anybody. It's not speaking in a language that people understand. And I, without going into a whole lot of justification for that, that's where my tastes are. And as a player, I've always gravitated towards using what I call the vernacular. Rock and roll, jazz, the popular, the elements of our popular musical culture that surround us. That is, everything that's not the class from the classical world.
Culturally relevant, I've heard it.
Yes,
Although
exactly.
that'll certainly
Culturally
offend
relevant.
everyone in that other camp. I've
Yes,
always
exactly.
found culturally relevant to be the most helpful.
Non-historic music. So,
Nice.
um, so he, as someone, he's from Puerto Rico, and so he uses a lot of Latin rhythms and that kind of stuff. So that's what attracted me to his music, because I didn't want to play something that was full of a lot of squeaks and squawks. I wanted to play my stuff grooves in all kinds of meters, but it often grooves. It's often in a tonal language that people get,
Hmm.
various degrees of accessibility or tonality, but generally in a language that we understand.
Sure.
So, and so does he. So we started off with that kind of, like minds. But within that context, I said, look, there are two things that are different from your average violin concerto that, in this project. One is that I'm not playing an average violin, playing the sixth string, which has a wider range, but also has the capability of all of these effects, which
Hmm.
he was very interested in.
Right.
And then the other thing is that I don't play it like a typical violinist plays. My vibrato is different. My approach is different. I'm intentionally often trying to leave classical sounds and sort of baggage out of it so that it's approached like somebody who is a jazz or a rock guitar player might approach this piece
Right.
with completely non-classical ears.
Hmm.
So I said, I intentionally take that approach in my ethic as a performer. So, you need to take that into consideration. And technically, I'm doing things like ghosting, strumboing type stuff,
Hmm.
multiphonics, and all this kind of stuff that's not going to sound, that are not classical techniques, that are
Hmm.
part of my daily
Bag.
vocabulary. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Part of my bag of tricks. So he was challenged by all of that and really ready to jump in because he's written a bunch of violin concertos. In fact, he had just finished one, or he was in the middle of
Oh,
still
wow.
writing one as he was writing mine. So talk about a challenge as a composer to be writing two violin concertos at the same time and make them completely different pieces, which they are. Anyway, so we would get together pretty much once a week on Zoom to just have a little chat, and I would play him back the things that he had just written because he was just writing in little installments, and he would send me, here's 2 pages of the violin part, here's another 2 pages. He would send me, here's a few pages of the score and the violin part every week, sending me another 30, 40 bars of music.
Hmm.
Incredibly uh, what's disciplined in the way he works. So we would get together and I would play it for him and I would show him other possibilities. What about this? This is just a little awkward. Do you mind if I just change a note here? It'll play much better. What is your intention here? What do you mean by these glissandos? How slow do you want them? All this kind of stuff, and just get our heads back and forth. And one of the things that I show, and in this part of this process, I would show him a lot of these techniques and effects. Here's what it sounds like with distortion. And I said, there's this cool effect that I used in my last concerto, which is a subtraction tone or difference tone. So if you play 2 notes, you hear a third note louder even than the other two that you're playing. You totally hear a 3 note. It's like an illusion.
Hmm.
So he said, "Oh my God, tell me about that. Tell me about that." So,
Tartini
so I was
tone? Is that what
explaining, how this. What's that?
Is that what that's called?
What's that?
Tartini tones? Is that
Martini
the?
tones, the same
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, I think they're all referring to the same phenomenon, and it's the difference between the wavelengths of the two pitches. I believe. So, so I was showing him all this stuff and how you can play a tritone and you hear the root. And if I play that tritone intonation a little narrower, the root comes up. And instead of it being a dominant seven, it turns it into a diminished seven. Like cool things, and how these double stops on a violin sustained with a bow with distortion create these sonic possibilities. And because one of the movements he was writing was based on a story about a fictitious planet that didn't really exist, he loved this idea of creating phantom notes that weren't really in the score, that were
Ah,
appearing audio, but it was not written.
right.
So I showed him, I made a chart and made a tape for him, made a recording for him, ages myself, of all these different
Reel to reel.
possibilities. Right. I can play these notes, you get this one. Play these notes, you get that one. Like a whole thing for him, and he used it in that movement all over the place. So stuff like that. But then he was writing stuff, and he would write that with like a crescendo and a diminuendo, like all of these dynamics. I was like, well, the electric instrument with distortion has a very narrow dynamic range. It's kind of like loud and a
Compressed.
little louder, and that's about it. And he
Yeah.
wanted to hear all of these things, so it's like, okay, well, I can do that if I have a volume pedal. Like I have a distortion all the way on. But he actually didn't want that. He wanted so I was like, I'm going to finally create this thing that I've been wanting to do all my life, which was to be able to have an expression pedal that would authentically bring the distortion channel of my instrument in gradually. And I
I
had
see.
tried for
Blending
years
with the.
blending.
Mhm.
So, years ago, I was using this amp that's behind me here. You can't really see it, but
Can't see.
It's a Mesa Boogie power amp and preamp with a Marshall 12 412
Four
cabinet
by
underneath it.
12. Yeah.
4x12, yeah.
Okay.
But the point is the Boogie has two channels basically, a clean and
Lead and clean.
a
Yeah.
lead and rhythm.
Lead and rhythm. Yeah. Sorry.
Right. And so in a little foot switch that makes a racket that you click it and it goes from one to the other because you're playing in a rock band, and why would you ever need anything else? So um right. And I love the distortion that comes out of those tubes, blah blah blah. And there was never a way, and I tried like having stereo amps, and how could I like mix the two, and
Like
you
wet
know
dry.
so I could control the drive, so I could have just a little bit of drive, And of course, the solution most people end up with, which I did, were like three or four different fuzz boxes of different this would be a overdrive. This is a metal crunch. This is that.
Like
So that you
stacking to stack them, or
or
to
just
just have
use them
separate sounds.
separately. I
Okay.
was using them separately at some
Hmm.
points, but I really wanted to be able to do this. And then I forgot about it for years. And speaking with Roberto, this was something that I felt like would be really useful in this piece, because he was writing these dynamics and wanted this effect to start with clean, and then for you to hear the distortion, and then for it to go back to just the two notes, and then you hear three notes, and then it goes back to two notes, right?
I
So it's
see.
like, okay, I'm going to figure out how to do this. And then it turns out it took me about a minute and a half to do it with this rig that I'm using, the Kemper profiler, because it
Oh,
has a
use a
pedal.
Kemper.
You can set up a pedal to do what they call morphing, which just changes between two sounds. So let me
I
show
see.
you what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Great.
And the underlying takeaway for this whole thing is the answer, kind of the big answer to your question, is that whenever I'm playing any of these pieces, whether it was this one, whether it was Dharma, whether it was Terry Riley's piece, the creation of the effects were always followed, like, the imagination of what could it sound like? What are the possibilities that I could do with this piece? How can we change it from black and white to technicolor, and take a diminuendo and turn it not into a diminuendo, but into a reverb trail that suddenly
Mhm.
gets longer or gets pitched,
Yeah.
brings in a harmonization or things like that. So
Mm.
the point being that the imagination, the musical imagination always was the instigation. And then, okay, how am I going to try to create this effect? Should I use the Eventide H9 for this? Should I dig into this thing? Should I, what effects do I need to go buy a pedal, which I've
Mhm.
done for in many cases just because there's a particular sound I wanted in this
Right.
one spot of the piece, and I would go out and buy the pedal and just have it for that.
So Tracy,
So
I want
that,
to unbox that for a
yeah,
second because
yeah,
there's so much great information. I just want to tease out a few of the
sure,
things you mentioned. I think starting with the musical imagination is kind of a big one. So it sounded like in most of these situations, obviously the Dharma piece doesn't have a lot of like out there effects. You're not using crazy distortion. That's kind of more about what can this. It's almost like, which is an approach I've seen a lot of composers use, where it's sort of like we want clean, we want a violin plus. Obviously, you're
yes,
doing a lot of the Indian effect, and it's
yep,
100% you in the stylistic stuff. But from a sound design element,
right,
it's kind of this clean violin plus this extra little bit of edge and cut
yep,
that sort of a piezo does. And obviously, the main recording that that you did is just was it BBC
yeah. We actually
uh,
recorded it at
at
Skywalker
AIR or Skywalker? Okay.
Skywalker out in California.
Yeah, yeah. So that's such a great sound. But it sounds like in this situation and in maybe others that you've done, it really is almost like just in the same way the composer is consulting you on what kind of techniques are in your, performance practice back. He's also kind of letting you sort of shape and introduce and come up with
Yes,
the ideas for the effects. So what that means is that you really need a big palette of what not only like what sounds do I have in kind of my main kind of Tracy Silverman set. I've got a distortion pedal, like you said, a fuzz box. I've got two overdrives. But also to sort of have this vision for how to be able to combine them and how to be able to very quickly, much in the same way a Nashville studio musician might on a session where the sound isn't quite right and the producer wants something else, and sort of be able to translate that into sound, taking whatever
yep,
technical things are involved. And that's something that a lot of us uh, don't practice or think of as like a really particular skill, just to be able to do that on the fly. That's really key, I'm sure, in those situations, right? When you're zooming with a
yeah.
composer and you just have to make compelling stuff happen or translate what's in your head kind of
And
immediately.
sometimes I would just with Roberto, we would be working on stuff, and I'd say, well, here's a spot where I'm going to look for a cool color for this. I might use some flange or chorus, and he's not even sure what that means.
Right.
And I'm like, um, when we were, I didn't really add a lot of that stuff till the piece was done.
Okay.
Some of it I just said, I might do something with this here, or the distortion stuff we needed to kind of talk about because that really changes the way you write. The way he would write for the instrument, depending on if I'm using distortion or not, and
Yeah, I was
but
going to
he,
say too. That's an interesting point because obviously distortion, obviously time-based effects, obviously even flangers and phasers. There are just certain things with those that work with the bow, and a lot of things that don't. And you have to have the experience of playing the effect or letting the effect play you. I guess is a good way of it
yeah,
becomes this part of the instrument. So yeah, that would obviously really good point, right? That would affect how he wrote. Um, or what notes he chose to give you, or the whatever
yeah,
articulation, right?
but
It's all
but
combined.
yes, and my point was that he basically had a lot of trust in saying, okay, I know I'm just going to write this. I want you to color it. I want you to add effects to it as you see appropriate. Um, but you know them better than me. He kept saying, you know your instrument much better than I do.
Mm,
I just run it past me what you come up with, and I'll tell you if I don't like it or whatever.
Yeah.
So more often than not, he actually didn't hear the most of the effects, like about 90% of
Really
the effect that I used. He didn't hear till he was there in New York to hear the premiere, because I didn't add them until the last couple of weeks.
interesting. Interesting. So
Because
you
the
had a
way
very wide berth with.
So he was just like, surprise me, I'm sure I'm gonna love it. Because at that point I knew so well, from working for 6 months with him on the piece, what his musical goals were.
Yeah.
I was not going to betray those and just take it somewhere else because I wanted to do something different with it.
Right.
I wanted to try to bring his baby to life.
Right.
And he was like, I'm trusting you to do that, to put clothes on this piece, and to finish it. So there was a lot of that, to kind of harken back to the John Adams piece, the Dharma at Big Sur. When John first started writing it, he asked me to send him a bunch of stuff that I'd recorded, and he mentioned in particular one sound that he really liked and one track, which was very helpful to me. He said, I especially love, what you did on this one. And I was like, well, that's some delay and some chorus. It's
Right.
kind of quite a bit of chorus. So it has he said, I love it. It sounds electric. It doesn't sound like an acoustic instrument,
Right.
but it's beautiful. It doesn't sound aggressive. It doesn't sound, it has it's beautiful. It's
Right.
a new, beautiful sound that an acoustic instrument can't do. And
Yes.
I really like that. So I knew that that's kind of what he was writing for.
That was the foundation of the, yeah.
Right. And I kept asking him several times in the process. I was like, I have a 6-string acoustic instrument. Are you sure you don't want me to just play it, because it's so organic sounding with the orchestra? You sure? And he's like, no, I want that sound that I heard. I want that electric vibe, because I want it to be like Hendrix meets India meets
Wow.
Miles Davis.
Yeah.
I don't want it to be pure
Yeah.
Indian Carnatic. I could get an Indian guy to play it.
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
want it
Just
to be
get El
classical.
Shankar to, yeah. to rip it.
Yeah, and
Right.
I get Itzhak Perlman to play it if I wanted to be classical. I want this. He was taking. Which he certainly could have, and so he took a lot of chances in the piece. A big one of which was me, because I was, virtually unknown. I'd just done Turtle Island stuff. So
That's not unknown, Tracy.
at any rate, so that was kind of, well, but in the greater world, it is, it's not Itzhak Perlman, So, as a soloist, for sure, And anyway, in that piece, I was very conservative with my effects. Most of the effects being the amount of delay, the
Delay,
time
yep.
of the delay.
Yep.
And that kind of thing. So I would have, spots where the delay is more pronounced, where it's less pronounced, and spots where the delay matches the tempo, obviously, of the piece, especially the second movement, which is very rhythmic. So, so things like that, very conservative stuff that I like effects where you don't notice them, like a good bass player sometimes.
Right.
You don't notice them because they're just right.
Right.
If I played it straight without any delay or without any reverb, it would sound really harsh in the midst of this very atmospheric orchestration. So I needed to play a sound that matched the orchestra there.
Yeah.
And that meant adding a very long, and also in the back of my mind was the fact that when John first started writing it, he was working, as he still does, what's his name now? I was hoping it would come to me. Mark, I'll think of it later. Anyway, an amazing sound designer, engineer, composer, who's been working with for years, who I need to get his name because he deserves, you can edit this. You can edit this. And I'm looking up in my contacts to find his name. Like how many
It's
Marks?
okay. We'll edit this out.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So Mark was someone who worked with
Anyway,
John, but also who collaborated
yeah.
with you in a way.
So so my point was that he was creating this tuned reverb, this really cool reverb that responded to different pitches that I would play. And the idea was that this he was going to add this from the mixing console
I see.
uh, during the performance, and this became not feasible. And Mark never finished writing the software and blah blah blah, you know. But but John was already thinking, how can I make this hyper violin? You know what I mean? How can I make this even more beautiful? He was
Yes.
thinking in those kinds of terms. So
Yes.
I knew what kind of effects he was looking for and stuff. I was using an H9, even tied to do like a tuned, pitched reverb in spots with
Yes.
just a little bit of that flavor up in the top end. So anyway, so that's kind of how that happened with Roberto. He was really interested in the distortion effects, the subtraction tones, and the piece has a lot of rhythmic stuff. We really wanted me to explain the difference between chopping and this other thing that I call percussive playing,
Hmm.
percussive bowing, and how I was muting different degrees of muting the strings.
Hmm.
And he wrote all this into the part, half muted here, half dampened.
Okay.
So here, let me show you because I'm doing a
Sure.
lot of talking about, it's like dancing about architecture, as they say.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Zappa, right?
I don't know who said
Dance,
that. It's been
talking about
attributed to a lot of people.
one of those internet memes.
Yeah, exactly. So just with a plain sound here, clean sound. The chopping stuff, of course, is all this, which he actually wrote into the piece with varying accents and spots where he wanted triplets, like with cross patterns, and then fours with all off beats, and he
Nice.
like got real complicated with it. But then there's the percussive bowing stuff is this, which is just like a bounced muted.
Muted. Yeah.
But he wrote different note areas, so like
I see.
and using it like that. And I was also using it not in this movement, but in this one. I wrote an effect that would help bring that out. So
Hmm.
the distortion and a low end that would bring out a percussive parts of it, so I can get. And then I was using it with a. Whoops, not on this one. Where the heck is it? With a wah
Wah.
wah,
Yeah.
doing stuff like that, and different amounts of.
Opening the filter.
So there's that. Right. So there's that stuff. Then I was talking about this morph pedal, which Kemper has,
Yes.
and which, so I have it set up here now on my pedal cam here. You'll be able to switch to. I just have it set up on a Roland EV5,
Expression pedal. Yeah.
expression pedal, standard
Right.
expression pedal, plugged in, and what it's doing is it's basically controlling my the amp settings so that I can go from.
So it's turning up gain or anything else, or
Yep,
is it just
it's
gain
turning up,
specifically?
well, mostly gain, and I have
Maybe a
it
little EQ change, or you just have it mapped to
exactly. So this is the software for it,
the
and
editor.
so the editor, which is super super useful. So if you see these red and blue dots here,
Yep, that's the mapping, right? So it's
that's the
going from
mapping.
blue to
So
red or to orange as the pedal goes up.
exactly. So as I'm from your pedal cam on the pedal cam now, I'm putting the morph pedal all the way to the toe position, to the heel position, and you can see that all of these parameters are changing. I could go to a different effect, like here on my delay. I'm taking off a touch of delay. It's very tiny, but you know, I could be doing stuff within the
Right.
flanger, within
Sure.
anything else.
Yeah, you're just mapping, MIDI mapping to.
Right. And that one pedal makes all of these changes. So
Yep.
I'm using it differently in different movements. In this movement, this first movement, you know, he starts off the whole piece like this with a. You know, with so that it goes into a. I don't know how well you can really hear.
Oh, that was quite clear.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if it's loud enough because the speaker's kind of behind the.
Oh yeah, no, it's I can totally hear it. Yeah.
So it's going to there. Different movements, I used it a little differently. Let's see, which one is it? I think it's in a stereo. I have a different distortion sound that I'm using a different amp, and the you can see over here. This is now using this Ace amp profile, which is different from some of the other ones. At any rate, I wanted this particular distortion with a flange on it for this one spot. And then I want it to go away. And so what I'm actually doing with my morph pedal is going in reverse and using it like this. And then going to when I go to the toe position, it takes the amp volume way down over here because, otherwise it would be too, clean would be too loud. And in this movement, let's see, which one is it? Forgot now. Oh no, it's not in this movement here. If I go back to second movement, I'm using it in a really dramatic way to bring out those undertones.
Oh yeah, right, because you get the overtone series, the way the distortion, it brings out those kind of odd harmonics, and then you get the swell of the. That's really cool, man.
Yeah, so that's the subtraction tone that I was talking about.
Yeah.
So check it out. So I'm playing just an E and a B flat. And he wanted you to hear that there's just two notes.
And then it becomes. Yeah.
And then it goes away.
Yes.
But check it out. If I make it a little bit narrower pitch-wise, which you don't hear that much acoustically from. But listen what happens to that undertone. So it goes. So anyway, just kind of a interesting thing. So
that's a great example, Tracy, of like how not just playing an electric instrument, obviously, because some of these things are a little bit more difficult to hear on an acoustic in some settings,
right.
But using an effect like distortion can actually achieve something that's a uniquely kind of musical goal and effect with bowed strings. That's a beautiful example of that. Really creative stuff, man.
You can't do on any other instrument, really.
Right.
Even guitar doesn't sustain the way we do with a bow.
Right. Yeah.
The closest would be maybe an organ with distortion, but you can't slide the pitches the way we can,
Yeah.
So here's an example of in that same movement, because again, this movement takes place sort of on this other planet. I wanted to have another otherworldly sound, so I have this sort of tuned reverb.
Yep.
So I would, some phrases would just like end with this little diminuendo.
So reverb with a pitch shift in the tail.
Right, exactly. So rather than just ending a line like, which has a little bit of it on there. I go like, and it really kind of disappears into what the orchestra is doing. So a lot of this stuff was designed to fit into whatever, the orchestral sound design kind of is.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wanted to just show you the back end of that thing. I guess I can unscreen share that.
Well, it's very, very cool stuff. Yeah, yeah. And it sounds like, a lot of the time, just to make a beeline into distortion for a second, which is like such a big part of your sound, obviously, as you said, coming from the rock thing, but also, so many of your albums, up to present, that's kind of like the foundational thing. Like your Beats album you did like I think 2 years ago now. It's like,
Yep.
It's you with that kind of sound, although your
Exactly.
sense of how you use it has definitely evolved since.
Yeah. It's now I play in a style that I call ugly violin playing. That's my term for it. It's just kind of exactly the opposite of everything they taught me at Juilliard.
I love it.
I'm going to do the follow-up record for Beats and Jams is going to be called Sick and Twisted.
Nice.
Just because that's just the way, it's some very distorted violin playing, which sounds really ugly to most string players, but sounds perfectly normal to most guitar players.
Well, yeah, yeah. I think it's funny. This is kind of it's a common thing that I think we all talk about. I'm sure you deal with this with the Belmont students, but I kind of call it chasing ghosts. One of the biggest things, if you're going to pursue your creativity in any way or find your voice, whether it's with, stylistic stuff or, effects, what does it mean to have your own sound or to be? And I really think the biggest thing is you have to avoid chasing ghosts. I mean, whenever I sit down to practice to this day, I still hear the ghost of one of my old teachers or another colleague, or you sit down in the orchestra and you try to play, the craziest lick from your new concerto, so they respect you. It's like, it's all about this. There's so much conformity. And then maybe you go into jazz and then it's like, well, can you play rhythm? Can you play Latin? Can you swing it? Quarter note equals 300. Let's hear Cherokee. Not a real jazz musician. So every kind of genre has this orthodoxy. And to just have the courage to say, I'm going to play ugly violin. I'm going to play the opposite of what all of those teachers from my past who I lived to satisfy at one point. I've evolved past that. It's so much easier said than done. I mean, obviously you model that for the rest of us with a lot of the work that you've done, but I think that is such a major stepping stone, and it's such a hurdle, right?
It's a really good point because, it's kind of like John Lewis said, like you have to be ready to get into some good trouble, and there was always a very big part of me that was, sort of rebellious and iconoclastic, and would want to just change what was there, just for the sake of it, So, you have to have a little bit of that, rebel without a cause kind of thing. I think a healthy dose of that is good, because you have to reinvent yourself, and that's hard to do, especially when we come from a tradition that's so sort of apprentice based. The whole idea of learning an instrument is sitting at the foot of the master for years, learning, watching, learning, and it's more like that is sort of in the Indian classical tradition.
Absolutely.
But that's what we're taught to try to model our teachers and our heroes, and that's what we're doing, and we're trying to do it as faithfully and purely as possible, and
Right.
a lot of in that classical conservatory tradition. But what you and I are doing is something very different. We are trying to create a new future, a different future. We're trying to pave a road and machete a path first, and then start paving a road so that other people with bigger trucks can come along behind us and travel freely. And this idea of playing electric violin at all, even in a rock band, was an anomaly and a weird thing when I started doing it.
Yeah.
And at least now that's fairly, a lot more common, which is wonderful to see. But the idea of it being a gimmicky thing that's not taken seriously is something that I've always had to fight against,
Right.
and which was a big part of my sort of legit side of my career, which happened just because I didn't become a rock star. If I had become a rock star, none of this would have ever happened.
Well, I think you did. You just, I disagree with with your premise there, but
But you know what I'm saying. The idea of getting more serious was sort of a plan B, partly. But
no, but I think that
yeah,
is that's part of that chasing
but
ghosts thing. Like the first thing, even with some of these other acts, like I don't know, I don't like using a lot of names, but a lot of these cover acts that'll play electric instruments and whatever. Um, I don't think there's anything particularly creative going on in most cases, but I think one of the things that they lean on and that you'll hear people say is, wow, such a great cellist. They're such great cellists or such a good violinist. It's like they're still kind of proving their classical bona
yeah,
fides. Maybe that's kind of part of the
right,
gig. So it's like, okay, they're a real violinist. Now maybe I can check out what they're doing. It's like there's
yes,
this
yes,
that kind of second layer of, and so we're sort of aware of it. It's like it's sort of the chasing ghosts thing again, right? It goes back to like, who are we trying to satisfy? Who are we trying to prove? But yes, it's
yeah. Well,
totally.
it's partly because nobody knows what it's supposed to sound like,
Right.
right?
What does an electric
You know,
violin sound like?
Exactly, which I know is really the underlying question of this whole interview that you want to dig into, and that's a really interesting topic because yeah, we can sound like guitars, and I've made no secret of the fact that I've spent most of my career trying to sound like a guitar.
Hmm.
The reason is because that's the lingua franca of my generation,
Hmm.
and of
Sure.
so much of the pop world. In terms of instruments that we're closest to, we're obviously closer to guitars than to keyboards or to even to horn instruments.
It's funny to think now, like just being at the NAMM show again, it sort of brought this conversation up or inspired part of this conversation. Now, of
Yeah.
course, the lingua franca is pads, maybe MIDI triggers of some sort. So in the
Yeah.
future, are we going to be trying to imitate? As that
Well,
evolves, are we going to be trying to imitate this? Because guitar is even like sort of. I hear it mentioned
exactly.
often, and is guitar on the wane? Is it sort of
Exactly.
not right? We're just going to be
Well, for
imitating
sure.
MIDI controllers in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And we can do a little bit of that, but I mean, we have strings, and so we're inherently a lot like other stringed instruments, other guitars more so than we are drums or keyboards or whatever.
Sure.
But and the guitar. Let's just assume for a minute that even if the guitar isn't a huge player, going forward for the next several years or whatever, it's played a huge part of our cultural sound. The idea of somebody strumming a guitar and singing a song is just about as basic to pop music as
Sure.
anything can be.
Sure.
So the idea of strumming, the idea of keeping time, of playing a chordal instrument, and backing up a singer or being a big part, a major part of a band sound, is just baked into our culture, into our
Sure.
musical culture, even in part of the hip hop world
Sure.
culture. So
Sure.
and so when I do stuff that to a violin player, they go like, "Oh well, that's nothing like any you can't it's nothing like what they taught me at Juilliard." And it's like, no, but it's nothing new in the guitar world. Throwing heaps of distortion and playing crazy weird shit
Sure.
has been going on for 50 years in the
Sure.
guitar world. I'm not inventing anything here. And it's just a matter of, as a player, are you accepting those sounds as part of your vocabulary? Like if you're an actor, and I've gone to Juilliard. I'm a Shakespearean actor. I know how to articulate and project my voice, and I can take on many layers of personality within my, whatever. So you have all of these wonderful techniques as an actor. But let's say you get hired to be on a TV show and you're supposed to be a high school kid or you're supposed to
Right.
be a dad or whatever
Uh-huh.
your role is, and you can't go around speaking like, like they taught you in acting school. You have to relate in a different way. You have to have your bag of tricks as an actor has to be bigger than that, or all you can play is Shakespeare,
Sure.
on stage and not even
Right.
on film. So as an actor, most actors develop a bag of tricks, and they
Sure.
have they can do a New York accent, they can do an Australian accent, whatever. That's what you do. That's what you train. And as a string player, I think we have the same obligation. We don't just get to play Mozart. It's not
Mm.
relevant. As gorgeous as it is and as wonderful as Shakespeare is, it's not the most culturally relevant thing right now in the literary world. It's always there. Beethoven is always there. Bach is always going to be there. These are the shoulders that we stand on and that writers stand on and build from. But they're writing contemporary stories that are snapshots of our contemporary life. And as any performer, as a musical performer, if you want to be relevant to your audience, you have to give them your view of the way the world sounds right now. It's
Yeah.
a snapshot, it's an artistic point of view.
Yeah.
And if it's not including the language that people are speaking, then, it's a very limited point of view.
Yeah, it's really laying down the gauntlet, though, in a way. I mean, most people spend their entire lives just trying to play in tune and accurately replicate
That's great. That's
their
great. If all you want to
their
play is
teachers.
Bach, and if all you ever want to play is Bach, that's great. And you
It's
know
a
what?
thing.
Many people have have done that for their entire careers, and
There'll
have
still be a
only
few jobs
been
left.
written.
This many. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's
But that's basically playing historical music, is what that
yes.
is.
Yeah. It's like being in a museum or something. Like, it's interesting. I saw this thing. It was related to swing fiddle. I remember I was going through a strings magazine. I don't know. I had the weird compunction to, hear about other people's careers for a minute, and and so yeah, they were reviewing it, and I was like, man, I just, it's so interesting to me. I mean, even that music, like, can you imagine? I know there are people that do that now, but still, like 100 years, and they reproduce Grappelli and play all Grappelli's tunes and play in a Grappelli style. There are people that love that, but yeah, it's very interesting to me. It's almost like saying, "Oh, Tracy, I'm a Baroque composer."
Right.
It's sort of
Exactly.
interesting. It's like, "Oh,
Exactly.
you're a Baroque composer. What does that mean to be a Baroque composer?"
In
In
2022.
2022? Yeah, it's
Right.
kind of the same deal.
It would be like Bach writing Gregorian chants and
Right.
limiting himself to Gregorian chants.
Exactly. Exactly.
And Bach's job, everybody's job as a composer is to tell their story, to tell the story of the world around them,
Right.
basically, the musical world around them, and to not close your eyes and ears off to that. Anyway, that's, always obviously been my path. Since when I left Juilliard, I was like, I made a very clear decision. It was a fork in the road, and I had to stop, trying to listening to those ghosts of the past who were, haranguing me on a fairly weekly basis whenever I would call home, about, when are you going to stop wasting your talents and get a, so, but that was my conviction that string players had to start updating their, not just the instrument, but the way they play it,
The
the
techniques.
things, the techniques, the style, the way you're using a bow, the sounds you're going for, the music you're playing, the grooves you're playing, the cultural references you're able to make within your sound. You sound like Hendrix or you sound like Jeff Beck or whatever, because you know what those things sound like.
Right.
Or Miles Davis, you have that like a Miles way of not using vibrato or whatever. Those are cultural references that are different from David Oistrakh and Jascha Heifetz
Sure.
and Tchaikovsky.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Tracy, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, you gave us a little bit of a peek into sort of how you're approaching the distortion effect and how you started with just a straight up, Mesa Boogie going into a Marshall, 4x12 or what, and then now you're all into the digital world with the Kemper, and we saw obviously some pictures, but just from a gear perspective, I wanted to ask you sort of how, you could even focus in on just, distortion overdrive sounds if you want to, but sort of how your approach has changed over the years, and maybe some of the principles that guided you into sort of finding not the specific pedals, because I want this to be evergreen and everyone's doing their own thing, but just the principles behind sort of how you discovered what you did and why you changed over the years. What sort of guided that?
Yeah, good questions. So to make a long story as short as I can, I was right from the get-go, as I said, I was really into distortion and into playing rock violin, not jazz, for instance, particularly. Although I loved jazz and had spent a lot of time transcribing Coltrane and all that kind of stuff. But wanted to do rock and roll, so I was using these solid body instruments that essentially didn't sound at all good unless you distorted them.
Yeah.
So that was kind of part of it. Was so by playing these instruments, I'm locked into distortion. It's like that ain't never getting turned off. It's always going to go through the distortion channel. Everything that I play is distorted. So that was kind of where I started. And I started with a Roland Cube 60 amp where you pull the knob and you get the drive channel.
Oh, I know it. Yeah.
Just a terrible solid state.
Solid state. Yeah.
Distortion with the instrument that I was using sounded just horrible. So I was like, okay, even with my, with the treble knob all the way down and the mid-range all the way down and the bass all the way up, it still sounds terrible. So what else, so where to go from here? So I spent a lot of time on 48th Street in New York, plugging into amps. I would go on a Tuesday morning when nobody was there and just play through all these amps. And I did a lot of that.
Without any pedals, Tracy.
Sorry, say that again.
Without any pedals. So in other words, I'm just starting with,
Yes.
I think that's important because a lot of people, they're like, oh, there's all these pedals and there's all these amps and there's all of these different preamps I can put before you see every string player with a Bags preamp or whatever, even though they don't know how to use it most of the time. And I think just that principle of starting with the end of your signal chain and working backward. Obviously, the pickup in your instrument, if the sound is crap coming off the pickup, it's to an extent usually going to be sort of a lipstick on a pig after that. But there are some limitations with, especially if you're just using a piezo pickup. And, even at NAMM now they have these 3D various, there's all these, there's a lot of new companies coming and competing with Mark and Ned and the Yamaha people, but it's still basically the exact same technology from the 30s. There are piezo elements under each string.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to plant a flag in that, and then I want to let you keep going. But you started with the end. Like if someone has a direct rig, to me, I'd say start with your reverb, start with your time-based effects, which are usually at the end, right? And kind of work your way backwards, because otherwise everything's going to affect everything else down the chain. And that can really mess up what you're hearing and your ability to just kind of make a good judgment on, is this the right sound for me or the right piece of gear? Anyway, please continue. I just wanted
to. Good point. And also means that because I knew that the sound coming off those early instruments was not great to begin with. So I knew that it was going to be a lot of fix-it kind of things with EQing and stuff like that. So I would think let me get an amp that sounds as close to the good sound as possible. Then I need the least amount of stuff in between.
Right. Because even if you got an EQ before that, then you're adding EQ to EQ to EQ, because the speaker cabinet has its own sound, and then the preamp section has its own sound, and right. So
Exactly, and it was pretty simple because almost all roads, that I was looking for were leading to a warmer, less shrill, shrieky, horrible, scratchy sound. So I was looking for speakers that were not, amps that were not keyboard amps, bass amps, amps that had a lot of coloration, that had warm sounding speakers, that had quickly discovered that I wanted tubes, not solid state, all of this kind of stuff, and trying Fenders, trying Marshalls, trying different amps. They, definitely had personalities, and I discovered that as much as I wanted to use a Marshall, the Marshall heads just sounded terrible
Oh
on
yeah.
violins. It was
Oh, they do. Yeah.
just ripped your head off. Fenders, although
Too jangly.
yeah, although I think the best Fender I ever played was a modded DeVille or something like that for a
Okay.
reverb, and man, that thing just sounded gorgeous. I don't know what they did to it, but it had all the warmth and all the clarity and all the sparkle at the same time.
Yeah.
Anyway, so so I say, like I went to boogies, but I know there are great examples and people have great Fenders that sound
Sure,
amazing.
but I mean,
Anyway,
are they
I
using
ended up
single
just
coil
getting that thing.
pickups or the things that those Fenders are really meant to exacerbate and to bring out? It's like, again, when you get to a violin and a bow, the harmonics and the parts of the frequency spectrum that are coming in,
Totally different stuff.
totally different, right?
Way
So it's
higher.
like when people go online and they say, okay, this is the, this amp sounds good, that amp doesn't sound good. It's like, wow, like your pickup system, again, you got to start with that basic chain, go to
Yep.
the end. Also, but would you recommend, I'm sure you probably do with your students, whether it's like with an amp sim or if they can get to a store anymore. Are there still retail shops in America? I don't know. Music stores? Maybe in Nashville. They're dying pretty quick out here in LA. To actually at least acquaint yourself with the general like categories, like obviously Fender has a very specific sound. Well, there are different amps, but there's a Fender, there's definitely a Marshall thing. A
Right.
Vox definitely has a thing, right? The AC, the 30 for sure, and just that kind of more, I don't know, fuzzier type thing that they have. But
Sure.
still a little jangly, and then like the Mesa thing, that then you're getting into like the cascading gain staging,
And
more modern type
and
sound amps.
even within the boogies, what I discovered is that I hated the what do you call it, the rectifiers.
Uh huh. The
I
dual
didn't like that
rectifier.
metal, that California metal sound was not what I was going for. It didn't sound good on violin. What I
Yeah.
liked were the Mark III, Mark
Yes.
IVs, the older,
The
sounding.
classics.
Yeah,
The classic
and I
Mesa
just
stuff. Yeah.
and it turns out, one of my favorite players was uh, Santana, and it turned out,
This was his
after
thing.
discovering that I really liked the sound of this boogie because it sounded like Santana, that's what he used, and I did, so definitely was driven by my ear, and that's kind of the big takeaway for a lot of this stuff is that no matter what amp I was using, like sometimes I'd have to play a gig on a Fender or on a Boss Tone or whatever, some goofy amp. I could get close to what I liked because I just knew, for the most part, I need to roll off high end. I need to boost the bottom end. I need to whatever. I knew what to do to make it sound listenable.
And now, of course, you've
So I
transitioned
can
to a
pretty
more
much
digital
take
thing,
any
right?
amp and tweak it. Yes. So now, over the years, I've used a lot of different rigs. So I started off for a long time. I was actually carrying this Mesa Boogie preamp in a case, and would use it, and it has direct outs, and I would go direct to the PA from that, which did not sound that great.
You need air,
But it
right?
was that you
You
need
need
air.
air. When we hear any sound of the violin, even if it's a distorted, if there's nothing
Yes.
in the room, what we hear is the violin sound is it bouncing off the walls of an acoustic space, right? So yeah, if you're not miking the cab or whatever, that's pretty
Yeah,
tough.
yeah. It didn't
Yeah.
have like it had it had a speaker. It was like in a recording out, so it was sort of like a speaker
Speaker
simulator,
simulator.
very early version of that
Yeah.
from the 80s.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was less than perfect. I moved from that to finally a pedal board full of a bunch of hardware that weighed a ton. Got sick of lugging that thing and paying overweight every time on that
Right.
thing. And then I was like,
And you were going with like a pedal in the box type approach at that point, like so no more preamp or amp, but maybe uh, distortion pedals or sort of
I was using
in a
that, and I was using a whole pedal board and the preamp, sending all of those into a preamp for quite a
okay,
while. So it was a really heavy rig. And then I just decided to downsize and went to a laptop running Ableton and the soft step and like a whole other rig.
so
I
is
would
this
have
like guitar rig you were using, or what were you
I
using
was
for your?
using was it guitar rig? I forget what I was using for the Sims and Sims
Okay,
at that point. I don't remember. I might have.
and all of your effects, everything was in the laptop, right? No pedals
It
anymore,
was
no nothing.
all Ableton. It was all scenes, Ableton scenes.
Hmm.
So, which allowed me, and then I was like, oh my God, it's like I suddenly have 300 pedals on my pedal board that I can choose from, right? I can do anything I want, you
Now, was
know?
that the paradox of choice? Were you like, okay, fuck, I don't want to do it, just go back to pedals, or was that like comforting to know
I
that you had?
loved it. I loved
Okay.
it because I could finally have different distortions for different tunes,
Yes.
not be limited to even as much as I loved that Mesa Boogie distortion. I didn't always want the same distortion,
Right. Right.
so I could tweak it, dial it, and EQ it, and it was like suddenly it was like being having my studio there, and I could program all of these different things in Ableton, so I could just access anything I wanted.
Yep.
So I was, happier than a pig and shit. And I had like a laptop off on the wing, and I would have an iPad on my pedal board, like on a mount, and it was super
Okay.
slick. And I had all of these, and a Cat 5
Yep. Cat 5 cable
cable
connecting them.
running, connecting to it, and all that kind of stuff. Um, and I did that for like a year, and I was just waiting for it to, for the axe to fall. I was just waiting for it to not work one night. Like the Cat 5, suddenly it was great at sound check. I go out to play and like nothing. And like, through some miracle of the stars being aligned, it never happened. But every night I was worried about it, and the sheer anxiety of that level of anxiety, coupled mostly, I was dealing with the anxiety fine. I'm used to dealing with a lot of anxiety in my life, so that was not new to me. But what finally broke my back with this system was that it didn't end up being much lighter than the preamp and all the pedals, just because with all the computer gear and
Just
the
got
cables,
crazier and crazier,
it
more and
ended
more expensive.
it
Yeah.
ended up being the same amount of weight,
Yep.
plus the nightmare of wondering if it was going to die. But the thing that really killed it for me was the latency. I could not get rid of the latency.
I see. Yeah.
And
That's a
and
serious.
and even though it was probably like 5 milliseconds, it was enough for me to discover something which I've talked about in my book subsequently, is this idea of the fact that as string players, I never knew this until this latency issue came up.
Hmm.
We instantaneously adjust our pitch. The moment we play a note, we are instantly making this slight recalculation.
Yeah. It's the speed in which we recalculate. Nobody hits the strings perfectly. It's just like you
Right,
adjust so fast,
exactly.
right?
There's
Yeah.
always an adjustment. It's an instantaneous adjustment, like almost a shifting of weight of your finger. This
Right.
tiny little thing that I did not know I was doing, and I was doing it faster than 5 or 10 milliseconds.
That's right. Yep.
It was an ear thing, like a feedback. Like my ear would hear it. I would fix it, and then I would go on with my business without ever realizing that that was happening. I've been doing
Yep.
that all my life.
Yep.
Suddenly, with this 5 to 10 millisecond delay,
Oh,
with
5 to 10. That's a real for you. Those of you string players that are watching this, anything over 5 milliseconds is like major trouble, right?
and I was chasing my pitch around. I was like, why can't I
Ooh,
play in tune?
wow.
Why can't I play in tune? What's going on? And then I figured it out because I guess I unplugged and played something else. I was like, I can play perfectly in tune when I play through my amp. What's going on here? And I went, you know what? I can't do this. I couldn't figure out any way to get the latency down. And I know there are ways to do it, but I couldn't do it with the rig or with the computer, the laptop that I had at that
Yeah.
point, whatever it was. And I went, I'm out of here. And I went and I had a gig coming up, and I bought this little Digitech
Right.
RP360,
Right. Little,
$198
yeah,
piece of
shitty
junk.
multi effects thing. Yeah.
Right, with like three, right, with three
Yep.
buttons on it. I was like, this
Yep.
is good enough for the gig. I used that for the gig, and I was like, holy crap! I'll be damned if those amp sims. And this was, I don't know, maybe in 2018.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Everything's pretty good now. At least. I mean,
And it's like,
everything. I mean,
I had tried like the Sans amp back in the 90s, and I had
oh
been
yeah. This is
working with these,
different world.
multi-effects things, and it's like nothing. They couldn't sound anywhere close, or the Line 6
Oh, the first
pod.
pods.
I don't
Yeah.
know if
Yeah.
you
The
remember
first pod. Oh my gosh.
those pods.
Yeah. The red one. The red
You
pill.
know,
The red bean.
the red one, yeah, the kidney, and they just didn't sound real. They sounded like a
No.
photograph of a sound next to a
Yeah.
microphone. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
just
They were
couldn't. I was like,
awful.
no, I'm not going there. So when I bought that thing, I was like, I don't really care for this gig. I'm just going to use it. And then I was like, holy cow, this thing sounds better than anything I can mic up in my studio.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so funny to me. This is something that I talk about too a lot when I'm like working with uh, people that are, trying to develop a rig and develop their sound and doing sound design. Is that in 2022 or 2018 when you tried it, everything on the market is pretty freaking good. If you can't sound good
Yeah.
with a Boss pedal board or a Zoom, to get into the $200 range, or a Moore, or pick your Chinese, whatever, in 2022, you're the problem. The box is not the problem. And I think that actually brings me to something you mentioned before that I wanted to catch really quick, because I think it's so important for people watching this, is you were talking about how you knew in a gig, even if the sound guy wasn't good or you had to use a different amp, you knew how to dial in with EQ. You had the skills with EQ, because a lot of string players, I always tell them, like, do you have the different frequencies of at least the open strings memorized? Do you know how to tell a sound guy when you're hearing too shrill, woofy, boomy, this? Can you give them a frequency to dial out, or could you do it yourself on an amp in no time? Because you don't have time, right? You may have a line check, you may have a sound check. Like, do you have the ability to really understand that part of your instrument? And sounds like that's something you're a big advocate of too. Is
Well,
there?
it changes constantly. And one thing, in talking about this like stuff with the orchestra, I really wanted to have an acoustic-y kind of sound, that's not gonna, that is at least for certain parts of the piece that are written in a more straight ahead classical kind of moments of the
Yeah,
piece. There are a few. I want to be able to sound, to blend and not to sound completely like to different. And what I found myself doing was in rehearsals, digging, pulling up the software and going, I just need to color this amp slightly differently. It's just a little too harsh, or it's a little too
yeah,
bassy. And just because in real life, finally listening to it, I would walk away from the stage and play, and I'm wireless, and I can listen to the speakers and what's going on with the orchestra, and go, okay, I need to change that, and making all these little adjustments. Something that as a electric string player, I've been mixing and producing my own recordings for 30 years.
That's it.
So
You are the
know
sound man. Even if there's a sound man, you've got to be the sound man, because no sound man knows what
or
you sound
to,
like, right? When it's an electric violin, right?
yeah, or to know that, yeah, or to know that if my sound is a little harsh, I need to just back off in performance with my bow technique. Or if I'm not getting, or if it's not enough warmth, I need to make sure my low strings are digging, actually altering my playing technique to make up for shortcomings that I may know are happening, but it's too late to change them, or
Right.
things like that. One
Yeah.
other little, so that kind of ability to play with what you have and to know that the end result you want the listener to hear, you may have to do something a little differently that night in order to get there.
Do you
Because
have a
what they hear,
routine, Tracy? Do you have a routine that you would either teach or that you do yourself? Like for example, I used to have a thing where I had two loops in my looping pedal. They'd already been recorded. I didn't even have to
right?
lay them down. The band could play along with it. It was just like, a groove or whatever for my set. And then I would walk out in the audience.
Yeah,
After the sound guy dials it in, I'm like, okay, I hear, okay, now I'm going to go back. And because obviously when you're playing, it's sort of this different
yeah.
thing
And
from,
you
do
hear
you
the
have like a,
acoustics. Yeah,
yeah, exactly, exactly. If there's acoustics involved or you're playing an amplified acoustic instrument, yeah, a lot of the wrong stuff is getting into your ear. Do you have like a routine or something you work on with your students to just kind of, okay, here's how you dial in your sound at a show, here's how you go
yeah.
about kind of, and did that
Not
change
really.
with an orchestra?
Yeah, not really. I'll just sometimes I'll loop something and walk out and hear it that way. Often I'll just hold my fiddle down and play, ask them to turn up the PA so I hear it more than my
Oh, okay.
acoustic sound,
Yeah.
coming from my instrument. But I just try to make it sound like the way I have it in my studio. So I tweak it so that it comes out of my studio speakers more or less the way I want it to sound. And then I go into every PA is going to be a little different. And if it doesn't sound like that, I'll just say, hey, are you guys EQing the PA? And sometimes they'll go, yeah, we rolled off this, we rolled off that. I was like, can you just let me hear it flat for a second?
Right.
And then they
Good
take off
advice.
all that and I go, that's perfect. Or I will like, yeah, oh, I'm glad. Can you take a little more off or something?
Yeah.
Whatever. Because
Very good advice
they're
there.
fighting with the room already. They know what the room is. So, so there's usually a little bit of that kind of stuff. But one thing I did want to point out that is an important part of my sound chain that we haven't talked about, and which I'm about to make a more permanent part of the instrument and have it actually installed. And that is a microphone in addition to the pickup.
Blending.
Blending an actual microphone like a DPA that's just picking up this weird sound of an electric instrument because there's no sound hole.
Oh, this is for an electric instrument you're
Yeah,
talking
so
about now, for
picking
your
up.
main acts.
So like when I
That's
played this,
interesting.
so when I played this concerto a couple weeks ago in New York, we recorded it. We did a whole recording session, and they put a good small diaphragm mic
Yeah, yeah, well,
over here
pencil
like
mic, yep.
as if I'm playing an acoustic instrument,
Right.
and without being turned on, all you're hearing is with your ear right down next to my bow. You're hearing a little bit of this, but you're hearing a lot of the sound. Just it's like playing an electric guitar that's unplugged.
Right. But you get kind of the bow noise and the finger tapping and some of just the realism of that is such an interesting idea, man. So you're
So
doing,
it has to have that bow noise. You actually hear breathing. You hear you can hear like before a pickup, like
yeah,
when you're doing that kind of stuff. All of that reality
just kind of makes it alive.
that makes it alive.
Yeah.
That makes it sound like a real person. Which when you only hear what's coming out of this wire out of the bottom of the bridge, you don't get any of that.
No.
So what I will do is leave my sound out of this Kemper that I've tweaked, that I've dialed, and I've got
Right.
an EQ on there. I've got a graphic. I've got the amps. There's tube bias, all of this kind of crazy stuff you can
Yep.
set to try to get the tone you like. keeping in mind that I'm going to add a little bit of presence to
And
that.
you
So
probably just feed that right to the sound man, so you don't have to worry about a stereo rig. And if it starts to feed back, which is even more of a concern with your instrument and the style you play, the sound guy's there to adjust
well,
that in an emergency situation, right?
what I've done in the past is I have a little mixer on a little Mackie 4-channel little tiny box on
Right.
my pedal board, and I'll take the DPA with a different wireless, going to a different wireless receiver. So I have two wirelesses going down,
Right.
one for the
Two
pickup,
two
one for the,
channels.
right, and just going into a mixer, and then I'll just, I'll have, it'll be mostly this one and just like 10% of that mic. Just,
That's so, yes. It's so interesting, Tracy. Like, we've done on the pickup test, my site, which is what people are watching this on, to qualify it. That's so funny. We did like a 3-part series on blending, all the different strategies involved, things you might want to think about, different sort of approaches to it used by different players, all of the things you'd ever want. And
I got to check that out because I was about to have something installed on this instrument.
yes, well, it's very comprehensive, but the
Well,
thing of
good.
it is,
There, man. I'm going to check it all out.
that's cool, man. But I would have never thought to do that with a solid body electric instrument, and I just think that is so cool. Again, particularly in kind of some of the genres you find yourself in, where you've got even in your smaller ensembles that element of chamber music, or that we always say most violinists want to have a basic acoustic sound underneath, with the effects as sort of like an icing on the cake. And obviously that's true of time-based effects, but even with like distortions, I find like generally, like for me, I always have wet dry. I always have some acoustic cello going, and the other stuff is being blended to different extents on top, in a parallel. But with you, like even like your distortion effect, for example, like you said, you're just going, you would plug right into the amp. You're not doing a wet dry thing with your effects. You're going straight. So yeah, that's such an interesting thing. I'm really going to have to kind of wrap my brain around that, but it makes so much sense, man. Yeah, like the
Well, I'll tell
DPA.
you how I discovered that is I did in my second concerto. I did a between the Kiss and the Chaos, did a
Yes.
recording with the Calder String Quartet. So I
Oh
did
yeah.
I reduced the orchestra thing to a string quartet, recorded with them. I went out to LA.
I went to school
With
with
one,
those guys. Yeah.
oh yeah, awesome
Yeah.
guys, great
Yeah.
players, and we recorded it out there, and then all the quartet stuff, and then I brought it back and added my electric stuff after the fact.
Okay.
And what I discovered was that it just wasn't. I could hear them breathing. That was the thing that tipped me off. It's like I could hear all of this incredible, because it was these great studio, great mics, and you could hear the room, you could hear the breaths, you could hear if somebody's moving their foot. You just had this sense of being in the room with them. And
Yes.
then I sounded like my amp was in a closet, with a mic on.
Right. Yeah. It's the
You
biggest thing
know,
mixers have to deal with, right? Oh, this guy sounds like he's in a different room now because he has a different
and
reverb
all
or a
the
different. How do I
and
put them all in the same?
I could not make the reverb make it sound real. I couldn't make delay make it sound real. I was like, what the fuck? What am I gonna do? I was like, I need to put a mic over it, and so you can hear me breathing at least along with them, and changed my life. I've never recorded anything serious without putting that over here, because you hear the bow. You just
Wow.
feel it. You hear
Wow, man.
subconscious, even 10% of that in the mix.
Such a great tip, Tracy. That's gold, man. I've never heard of an electric violinist doing that. So that is
Yeah.
so cool, man. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah.
thank you for sharing all of this amazing knowledge and wisdom and just your journey. There's just a lot of stuff I know I'm going to take from this interview, and I know
Thank you, man.
everybody watching as well. It's just you continue to inspire us. So
That's so sweet. There's nothing more gratifying to me, honestly, than to know that there are people who are interested in this at all and interested in geeking out about this. And just that there are string players who are really looking to take this path forward, because, man, when I started doing this, it just seemed like nobody cared.
yeah,
And it's just great to see how much interest there is in all of this stuff and all the amazing stuff that you were doing with the pickup test and all of the
Well, thank you,
cello
man.
um, improviser's guide and all of that stuff. Man, we're just taking that flag down the field, one, 5 yards at a time.
I hear you, man.
So,
I hear you. I wanted to
yeah.
ask you one more thing.
Yeah.
Desert Island piece of gear. Can't not counting your violin. This is a gear porn question for all of the people who like to post pictures of their pedal boards on
Well,
forums and
I
are
mean, the
kind of
obvious thing right now would be the Kemper because it's doing everything pretty much.
all pedals in
Um,
the Kemper. All of them.
I'm using all the sounds. The only thing I'm using on my pedal board, as you'll see from this very long iPhone video that you're going to get that has like 2 minutes of usable material. Um, all I've got on that pedal board is the Kemper and a boomerang.
Oh,
That's
right.
all
Yeah,
I'm
for
using.
your looping. Yeah, we
Yeah.
didn't talk about your looping, which is
That's all I
such a
use.
cool part.
Well, and I've got yeah, right. And I've got a couple of expression pedals, and I've got also a page turner thing that I've got down there. You'll see it's a Firefly, just because I was doing this all with an iPad.
Sure.
Usually I'm playing stuff by memory, so that was kind of a new thing for me. But that so all I'm using is that for everything. So obviously that would be the thing. Except I would be like Kemper or boomerang, Kemper or boomerang. Which but I can't really use the boomerang without putting some good tone into it.
Sure. Sure.
But
Yeah.
I can't, I could not do a gig without a boomerang.
How long have you been using that?
I could do a gig like I could probably plug this thing directly into a PA system and make it sound decent because this is a pretty damn good instrument. And
Hmm.
it doesn't sound bad, just like you could, I've done it where, we always have an emergency line, which is just plug the violin into the board, if everything else fails kind of thing. And I always, would EQ that beforehand. You just roll off the top end or, do your EQ, your board EQ on it. And I could do a gig with just my boomerang,
Just the
but I could
boomerang.
not do a gig with just the Kemper because I loop everything. So,
That is so cool, man. Yeah, that is absolutely fantastic. Fantastic. We'll go with the boomerang then for your
yeah.
answer. Right on.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for doing this. Thanks for letting me chat about all this stuff.
Oh, it was a complete pleasure, man. Please come back anytime.
Yeah,
I feel like we could have gone another 3 hours,
I know.
but I know you gotta something
I
happening here in a
actually
couple
have an
minutes.
appointment with. I actually have an appointment in 20 minutes with the guy in Nashville who lives about 20 minutes away from me, who made this instrument, Joe
Okay.
Glazer,
Yep.
who we are working on a version of this neck strap, which I think you may have heard me talk about.
You did mention that in our interview. This is
This thing and
the
this
new
thing,
thing.
we're trying to get this thing. I've got a patent for it. We're just trying to get the prototype happening. So that's where I'm headed. And also, I'm going to try to see if I can get him to rig up a DPA mic here with like a volume knob. But I'm going to look at everything you've got on your site first.
Right on, man.
Get
Well,
get up to
check. Yeah,
speed on the state of the art.
check it out, man. Yeah, absolutely. And also, anything you'd like to plug? I didn't even mention the book, the site, obviously the podcast again, your website.
Probably the courses, the Strombone Groove Academy is where all my courses are living. That's if you Google that, it's like the URL is too long to say, but if you Google that or if you go to my website, you'll see links to it from my website. But yeah, that's where my courses are. The podcast for the Greater Groove. Getting back to it, a new one coming out this next week. Of course, who knows when this will air. That's about it.
Cool,
Good
man.
stuff.
Well, Tracy, thank you for everything, and we'll see you
Pleasure.
real soon.
I hope so, man.
Take care.
Thanks, Jacob.